Hey guys, and welcome to our discussion on competence versus performance. So when we see other people make a speech error or spell something wrong, we sometimes assume that maybe that speaker or that writer didn't know the correct way to say it or the correct way to write it. But decades of linguistic research tells us that one's competence in a language can be very strong and very high, but that doesn't mean they're never going to make mistakes and produce errors. Errors are just part of using language. So, linguistic competence is defined as an internal mental grammar. This internal mental grammar is our intuitions about what sounds right or what sounds good or what is the correct way we want to speak or write. So we have this internalized grammar that helps us produce judgments on how we should use the language. So let's look at two sentences to gain an understanding of linguistic competence. Tommy threw the ball and the ball was thrown by Tommy. Now, you may not remember the grammatical terms active voice and passive voice, but as speakers of the language, you actually know how to produce an active sentence and a passive sentence without even knowing what these terms mean. So in the first sentence, Tommy threw the ball, Tommy is in the subject position and the verb is threw. Tommy is doing the throwing, and that's why we call it active voice, because the thing we find in the subject position, in this case Tommy, is the thing that's performing the action of the verb. Tommy is the person doing the throwing. This is called active voice. Now notice how in the second sentence, the ball was thrown by Tommy. Tommy is now at the end of the sentence, and the ball is now in the subject position. But the ball can't possibly be doing the throwing, right? The throwing is being done to the ball. That's why we call this passive voice, because the thing that's doing the action with the verb, in this case Tommy, appears after the verb. And notice the various things that we had to do to a sentence to make it passive rather than active. We had to first change the subject. Tommy went to the end of the sentence. And then we added the word by, the preposition by, before Tommy. We also had to change the verb from threw to thrown. So threw is a simple past tense and thrown is the past participle. And then we also had to add some form of the be verb. And because the original sentence was in the past tense, we used the past tense form of the be verb, which is was. That's a lot of change. Many times we are not aware of all the fancy and complex things we're doing with language. You're doing all of this because of your linguistic competence, your internal mental grammar that informs you on how to form an active or a passive voice. It's kind of cool. So somewhere along the lines, whether you learned English as a first language or a second language, you internalized this grammar. Okay, now I want you to give it a try. Here we have the sentence, Katie bought her children some tacos. First, go ahead and decide whether this sentence is in the active voice or passive voice. I'll pause for a few seconds while you think. Figure it out? It's in the active voice, and we know this because Katie is doing the buying. She is performing the verb. Now I want you to pause the video and prove to yourself that you can change this sentence into a passive voice. So go ahead and pause. I'm guessing you probably came up with something like, some tacos were bought by Katie for her children. And you probably realized that you had to add a couple of things. One of those changes, was that you had to add a form of the be verb to the sentence. In this case, you added the word were. You had to put were in the sentence as opposed to was, because the form of the be verb had to match the plurality of the subject. So we have some tacos, which is plural, and not just taco. If it had been taco, you would have said was, and said something to the effect of, a taco was bought by Katie. For the be verb, we have a certain internalized grammar that I'm guessing you were never explicitly taught, unless perhaps you learned English as a second language. But for those of you who acquired English when you were young, you knew that we use the form were for plural subjects like tacos, they, and we, and we use was for singular subjects like taco, I, she, he, and it. This is all a sign of your linguistic competence. So now that we've talked about competence, let's turn our discussion to performance. Every once in a while, we make errors despite being linguistically competent. Errors, whether in speech or in writing, are common even with the most articulate and smartest people in the world. There are many different types of errors, and here I'm just going to discuss a few of them. Let's first talk about false starts. We do this a lot in speech. In fact, you're so used to hearing it, you just kind of ignore it. This is when someone is speaking and perhaps midway through a word or even a sentence, they think of something else they want to say. And so they start over. So I can say, she and they went to the store. Another common speech error is the mispronunciation of words, even if we know the words pretty well. In fact, my cousin, who is probably one of the most well-read individuals I know, will come up with some pretty awesome mispronunciations. For her, it's because she has read the word before in a book, but has never heard the word before. So she can not only spell the word and tell you what it means, but if it's a word she hasn't said before or heard it said before, her pronunciation guess is pretty awesome. One example is the word Montessori, which she had read somewhere, but having never heard the word before, she pronounced it as monastery. And again, my cousin is actually way smarter than me, but mispronunciations happen to the best of us. And we also see it picked at in movies like Megamind. For example, he'll pronounce Metro City as metrocity, like the word atrocity. Then there are speech errors like brain farts and mumbo jumbo, mistakes we make when we're tired or hungry or just not paying attention to the language we're producing. And I'm not saying that speech errors are wonderful. Sometimes they can be embarrassing, just as I assure you my cousin was thoroughly teased by her siblings when she mispronounced Montessori. But we need to recognize that just because somebody performs an error in their speech, it doesn't mean that they don't know the difference between what's considered standard and non-standard, or right and wrong. Their performance error does not mean they're not linguistically competent. One last speech error type I want to cover real quick is slip of tongue. A few examples would include saying something like power flot instead of flower pot, or reading a dog to my book instead of reading a book to my dog. The first slip of tongue is a phonological error, and phonology has to do with sounds, so here we're flipping the first sounds between the two words. The second example is a syntactical error, and syntax has to do with the order of words in a sentence. So here we're flipping the place in the sentence that dog and book occur. So most of the errors we just discussed are pretty much errors we have in speech, but obviously we can have performance error in writing. So one example of a common performance error in writing are with homophones. These are words that sound the same, they are pronounced the same, but they have different spellings and different meanings. So there, and to, and to. I make mistakes like these in writing all the time. It's not because I don't know the difference, but because they're homophones. I may initially type the wrong there in an email. Again, if someone uses the wrong spelling of there or your, it doesn't automatically mean that they don't know the difference between your and you are. It could simply be a performance error. Now, sometimes people have to be taught the difference between these words. Sometimes people have to be corrected because they genuinely don't know which one is correct. And you may even be able to think of some people that need to be taught the difference. I remember being in 4th grade and wanting to ask my teacher which form of there and there meant what, but I was too embarrassed. Yet at some point, someone taught me, or I observed the difference enough to become competent in those two forms. But initially, I just didn't know the difference, so this was a competence error. Now that I know the difference, anytime I make the mistake of using the wrong form of there, it's just a performance error. If you are producing errors, these could be performance errors. You are linguistically competent and still capable of performance errors. Performance errors do not mean you're not linguistically competent. In fact, we're so used to performance errors that we typically ignore them when we hear them. But they are there nonetheless. Errors are part of using language. So that is a very brief look at the difference between competence and performance in language.